All right, as this amplifier is warming up, I'm just going to wait until there's actual sound coming out and people can actually hear me. Okay, people can actually hear me now. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our event tonight. We really appreciate having all of you here. Thank you for coming out. We at Green Apple Books want to continue to provide safe in-person events here. So thank you all for being here. And just a reminder, if you're attending the event tonight and in this event area, please keep your mask on at all times. I just want to let you know about our upcoming events, which on March 22nd, we will have John Searles. It'll be an online event that is ticketed, and the ticket comes with a copy of the book. So I believe you have to purchase those tickets. And then on March 24th, a collaboration between the Ruby and the Freya project will be a benefit for the Bridget Alliance, which is an organization that assists with getting abortion care to people that need it. You can view our full event calendar on our website. That's greenapplebooks.com/event, not events, event singular. Very easy mistake to make. And as always, please do buy books tonight. Please support us, as we love to support our community and have people like Monica and Buster here tonight. And before we get started, I'd like to introduce Wayne from Braver Angels, who's going to share a few words about their organization.
First of all, I'd really like to thank our authors for being in town and giving us this chance to see the craft and what you've created. You know, that's theory, right? A book is like the classwork. We're reality at Braver Angels. And so in San Francisco, we have a Braver Angels Alliance. It brings in people who are interested in the political world and trying to find a way to communicate across the blue-red divide. And I know, again, the theory is that doesn't sound like it'd be that hard, does it, to communicate across the divide? We found that workshops are very important to help you learn the skills so that you can actually do it effectively. And we practice what we preach. And that's really what I'm here to show you, is that Monica, who actually not only wrote this book, but works for Braver Angels as well, exemplifies the national level in the theory. In practice in San Francisco, we're here for you. We've actually got an organization. In fact, Monica will be having a discussion with another Latin American man who's a red, right? To have that balance between red and blue, to show people how we can communicate with each other and discuss those issues. That'll be Saturday at 11 a.m. And we've got the flyers in the back if you'd like to go on Zoom and join us for our Braver Angels event. Again, that's this Saturday. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Wayne. So to kick off this event, I'd like to introduce our speakers tonight. So first up, this will be a very interesting time with this thing acting like that. So first up, yeah, I'd like to introduce Buster Benson, who is an entrepreneur and former product leader at Amazon, Twitter, Slack, and Patreon. He's now CEO of 750words.com and writes for Medium and busterbenson.com. He is the author of Why Are We Yelling? The Art of Productive Disagreement. Please welcome Buster Benson. And in addition, we have Mónica Guzmán. Mónica Guzmán is a bridge builder, journalist, and entrepreneur who lives for great conversations sparked by curious questions. She's director of digital and storytelling at Braver Angels, the nation's largest cross-partisan grassroots organization working to depolarize America, host of live interview series at Crosscut, and co-founder of the award-winning Seattle newsletter, The Evergrey. A Mexican immigrant, Latina, and dual US-Mexico citizen, she lives in Seattle with her husband and 2 kids and is the proud liberal daughter of conservative parents. Please welcome Mónica Guzmán.
Should I use the other mic, do you think?
Yes.
We'll just switch back and forth.
Yeah.
What do you want to do?
Just try it out and we'll see what happens.
Okay.
All right. So first of all, I'm so excited to be here to interview and talk with Monica. I've known you for like 15 years, probably, from 3 lives ago in Seattle. And I'm just, yeah, I just love your book. And I remember, I want to tell a story really quickly, because for people that, you know, have been reading a lot of books, like the process of writing a book is really arduous. And I remember Monica writing to me in November of 2019 saying like, I got this idea for a book. Here's the title. It's the same title. And I'm gonna write it in like 3 months, 4 months, and it's gonna be published before the election in 2020. And I was like, the intentions are good, but I don't know if it's gonna be practical. But here we are 3 years later and it's published and it's got it in hand. It's a beautiful book. So glad to be here. So yeah, I'm gonna just ask a bunch of questions. There'll be time for questions from y'all at the end. But if you have something burning, like I think it's okay to raise your hand and ask, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's start with like the beginning of the book. Like this book is a great read, really fast, really full of insights and really practical advice. And it opens with, you know, I don't know how many people know this, but like your parents are immigrants from Mexico. And tell us a little bit about them. Like, what is it about them that makes you say like talking about them stops all conversation?
Yeah. So, and I'll grab this because Jake told me earlier that we're gonna try to get right in there on the mic. So maybe we'll pass it back and forth.
Sure.
So, yeah, I discovered a strange new party trick in Seattle after the 2016 election, and I would go to events, dinner parties, get-togethers of all kinds. Inevitably, the conversation would turn to politics because everyone was really freaked out in Seattle, especially in Seattle, very blue place, Democratic place. I'm liberal myself. We were all feeling this anxiety. And so the conversation would turn to politics, some headlines, something Trump had done. And then inevitably it would go to the people to blame, just the people who voted for Trump. And that's when something happened with me, because I would hear people talk about people who had made this very different political choice that confounded a lot of my friends, as if they were monsters, devils, using all kinds of labels. And I would feel my heart start to beat because my parents are Mexican immigrants who voted for Trump. And so what I would do is I would, you know, if there was a drink in my hand, I'd take a sip. And then I would say, well, you know, my parents are Mexican immigrants who voted for Trump. And that would, at that time especially, stop conversation. Just
Screeching of wheels.
And then what I would wait for is to see if to see what the reaction would be. Would they walk away? Would they look at me really suspiciously? Would they change the subject? Or would someone ask why? And that's what I was waiting for, was for someone to get curious.
Great. Yes, here.
Yeah.
So I guess this is a question that's on a lot of our minds, is like, what do your parents think of the book? Like, what kind of feedback have you gotten from them? Do they feel like they were presented fairly? Would they have changed the book in any way? Did they give you suggestions for improving it? All that.
Yeah. So the book is, you know, the subtitle is How to Have Fearlessly Curious Conversations in Dangerously Divided Times. And the biggest models for me personally are my parents. We've been having these conversations ever since they became citizens in the year 2000, making me at the age of 17 automatically a citizen at the time. And I came home one day, plopped my backpack on the floor, looked up above my mother's desk where there was a bulletin board and saw a Bush Cheney sign there. And I thought, Republicans? Really? And I watched like CNN headline news after school, and I just figured, I don't know, I just got it in my head, like, I'm leaning Democrat for sure. My parents will too, because, you know, whatever, we get along. And that's where it all started. But to answer your question, I wish that I could show you the Facebook photo that my mother posted the other day, where it's my mom and my dad, and they're holding the book and they're pointing at it all excited. And in Spanish, it says, you know, te queremos mucho, mijita, estamos tan orgullosos de ti. We're so proud of you. So they've read multiple drafts from the very beginning, and have gotten, you know, been pretty open with me, and have allowed me to share their story, in part because, you know, they agree that we have to do something to be less divided. We're so divided, we're blinded. We're not seeing people for who they are. You look across the divide, it's like a reality distortion field. The social science research shows us that over and over again. So we have to find some way to talk with people instead of about them, so that we can see clearly across that divide.
And you talk a lot about how we have siloed each other. Like, we don't run into a lot of people that are of different political opinions with us anymore. And what really, like, one of the most powerful parts of this book is you talking about sort of the thinking behind how you felt after the 2016 election, and then what you did as a result. So there's a big story in there, but it's basically she goes to Sherman County, which is sort of the polar opposite of Seattle politically. So 74% of people voted for Trump versus Clinton. And I'm just curious to hear, like, that you are actively swimming against polarization in this side, going to the other side. How did you feel? Like, how did you think about this? What made you want to do it? And did you feel like coming out of it that you got what you wanted, or was it something else?
Oh yeah, good question. Yeah, so there's a chapter in the book, chapter 8. It's about assumptions. All the chapters are one word, it's like opinion, reason, assumptions, and all these. But the chapter on assumptions tells the story of this trip. So after the 2016 election, like I said, Seattle on November 9th felt dead. It was just, a crushing blow in so many ways to the psyche of the city. I had just founded the Evergrey, which is a newsletter and community that held as its core value curiosity, honesty, boldness, and inclusion. And so, we were asking ourselves, inclusion, what does that mean? And there's a thinker named Ibu Patel with an organization called the Interfaith Youth Council, and he talks about how it's not just the diversity you like. That there's diversity on race, gender, ethnicity. There's also diversity of viewpoint, and that one is a difficult one for people to grasp. So after the election, I had all that in my mind. Me and my co-founder saw this interactive map in the Washington Post, and you plugged in the county that you were in, anywhere in the United States, and it spit out the county nearest to yours that was politically exactly opposite in terms of election results in the 2016 election. We learned that King County's opposite county was Sherman County, Oregon, the second smallest county in the state, highly agricultural, completely different planet in terms of lifestyle. And we asked our newsletter readers, it sounds like you all are telling us, some of you, and they were at that time, that you want to be curious, but you can't because you don't know any, you hardly know any Republicans, or you really aren't even sure about a different lifestyle that could lead to a completely different choice or any of that. There's a lot you're wondering about the urban-rural divide. So basically we asked them in the newsletter, if we could find a way to get curious with folks who voted opposite, right? Instead of just talking about them, would you want to go? And they said yes. And so that started it's a miracle it even happened in some ways, but started with Googling, finding this lovely woman, Sherry Caseberg, in her 80s, who was writing like a blog for Sherman County and knew everybody, connected us with a man named Sandy, on and on and on. But we partnered with Sandy, a longtime agricultural agent, to create this day where we would go down, 20 people from Seattle, to Sherman County. There was a short bus tour where we drove around these endless wheat fields and learned a little bit about them, how to tell the difference between a seeded field, and one that was laying fallow for the next harvest, and all of that. And then they had a lunch of sandwiches and everything that they donated, and so we ate together. And then we paired up for political discussion. So in the book, I interview. Out of that trip came a bunch of friendships, including some that are really near and dear to me. But I also talked to other folks who had been there from Sherman County and from Seattle, and it was a pretty pivotal moment for folks. It just scratched the surface. I mean, we didn't go deep at all. What it did was this, though. In a lot of folks' head was a stereotype. Folks in Sherman County had a stereotype about who was going to come off that bus. When I talked to them about it, like, oh, we thought maybe it'd be bunch of young kids with tattoos and signs and stuff like that, right? And the people from Seattle had a stereotype too, about what they would be like. Ranchers, farmers. Somebody told me I sort of assumed they'd all be simple-minded. Oh my gosh, right? Not the case at all. So what we did was we replaced our stereotypes with real living human beings, and I think that was one of the deepest impacts of the trip.
Nice. And so I like thinking about this because there is a lot of, like, the intentions are good, it all sort of worked out. And of course, there's always this fear, and your book is titled Fearlessly Curious Conversations. Like, there's still this chance that you're going to get in this room and it's all going to go down like a flaming, flame, right?
Yeah.
So, and you described the first interaction, or one of the first interactions you had with Sandy, even before the first meeting, where you were reviewing sort of the agenda and reviewing the questions you're going to ask the groups. And he gave you some feedback about like, these questions are filled with assumptions.
Yeah.
And then when I was reading, it's like, oh yeah, that's exactly when it would go off the rails, right? Like that's exactly when you would be like, no, it's not, or you could sort of dig in your heels. But you did something very different, and it sort of exemplified to me like just how sort of ingrained you have this sort of instinct for curiosity. Can you talk about like that conversation, and like for those of us who don't have that instinct, like how do we start training that?
Yeah. So what happened is we worked with Sandy to come up with questions that we hoped would spark conversation, and we were careful about how soon to get to the raw political stuff. The first question we had folks pair off and answer with each other was, what's your favorite childhood memory? To make sure that we established humanity before we started bringing in our opinion and making things a little bit more charged. But then we had, before even that, actually, we did this group activity where we had folks kind of put themselves on one side of the room or the other based on their answers to certain questions. And so we did that. And then once they got into the activity in the pairs, among the questions that they could choose were, what most concerns you about the next 4 years? And what hopes do you have? What do you hope for will happen in this country in the next 4 years? And Sandy looked at that and was like, why 4? Don't you think Trump will get reelected? Do you think Trump will not get reelected? Is that what you're saying? Like Trump's not going to get reelected? Is that what we're just going to put that assumption out there for folks? And I was like, at first I was just so mad, because he just came right out the gate, saying that. And I was like, hey, we worked hard on these questions. I don't know that assumption is baked in. And then I sat there and I thought, no, it is. He's right. There is an assumption that we're only talking about the next 4 years. And that is not open-minded to the experience of folks like my parents and many others who would hope for 4 more years of a Republican administration, and someone that many of them deeply admired. And so, yeah, I mean, the practice is definitely, every time that I talked to Sandy, I did have this sort of radar going of, all right, make sure that when you have an assumption come up in your own mind, you turn it into a question. And that's a tactic I talk about in the book, that curiosity begins when we turn our assumptions into questions, assumptions that we make about other people. They are everywhere. They are running rampant right now. And it can be a difficult task because we have so many assumptions, and the signals that are coming at us from our silos, mostly our phones, right, that we design to have the media and the voices that we like for whatever reason. It just does make it very dangerous, because we can think that we know other people, or we think that we know everything there is to know about other people. And of course we don't. And the enemy of the arch-villain of curiosity is certainty. If you think you know, you won't think to ask. And assumptions are certainty, covering up the questions that we could be asking, killing them before they're able to really express themselves in our mind and we're able to connect with other people.
Nice. This is a great segue. So I want to talk about questions, and also about the relationship between curiosity and confusion. So like, you talk a lot about curiosity. One of the hallmarks of it is not knowing something, right? And we tend to have many different reactions to not knowing something. It's an uncomfortable feeling, especially if it's something that we feel like we should know, or feel like something that we have to fight for, or something that makes us threatened. So I guess my question is, when you think about being in this moment where like something happens and you're confused and there's a chance of being curious about it. Yeah. What are the kinds of questions you can ask yourself? What are the kinds of questions you can ask other people to help you sort of get on the right side of the tracks on that one, in terms of like just not falling into the trap of feeling entrenched, feeling defensive, feeling sort of threatened?
Yeah. So the science of curiosity and how it works as a mechanism in our brains was one of the most fascinating things I learned as I was writing this book. And curiosity is a craving for knowledge, and it works a little bit like the craving for food when you're hungry, the craving for water when you're thirsty, with one really key exception. When you are thirsty and you drink water, you're no longer thirsty, right? You're going to be thirsty until you drink water. Great. But your curiosity can turn off as soon as your attention wanders away from the thing that sparks it. And what sparks curiosity is a gap between what you know and what you want to know. As long as your attention is on that gap, you can be curious. And that curiosity can change the world. Sometimes you're driven to just like, if you've ever been, suddenly finding yourself going down rabbit holes on something that you're learning, that's called interest-based curiosity. It's enormously powerful. There's another kind of curiosity though, and that's called deprivation-based curiosity. And the silly way to describe deprivation-based curiosity, I suppose, is if you're sitting with a bunch of friends and somebody goes, it's like that guy in that movie. That guy in that movie, that guy. What was the guy? No one knows the guy. And so it's like an itch you can't scratch. There's a gap between what you know and what you want to know. And what you want is to relieve the anxiety of not knowing. That's deprivation-based curiosity. And so someone will pull out their phones and find it. A more serious example of that kind of anxiety is, I'm scared of the virus. I'm scared of COVID. When is that vaccine coming out? I mean, I remember checking over and over and over again, when it was sort of imminent, like what's happening? When am I in line? When will it be available to me? That was an experience I had. That's deprivation-based curiosity. So particularly with deprivation-based curiosity and really all of it, when we are afraid or when we are confused, what happens is the work we think it'll take to fill that gap becomes either too scary or too much. So confusion is usually the feeling of sort of being too much. I don't know where to start. It's an unpleasant feeling. So I'm going to take my attention away from that gap. And where am I going to put it? On some kind of certainty. I'm going to find some answer. Somebody give me an answer. I'll go to my favorite site. I'll go to my opinion commentator. Oh, they just said this. Great, I'll take it. That's an answer. Good. Now I don't have my deprivation-based curiosity. I no longer have to put attention on that gap. I feel better, right? That's what happens when we're confused. When we're afraid, then that gap becomes something that we're afraid of what we might find. We're afraid that the journey itself will just threaten us or just be really uncomfortable, like you said. And so we sort of shrink inward and we're really not sure what to do. And so one of the overall strategies there with confusion is to reframe confusion as complexity. So when you think of confusion, of course, it's a negative feeling. When you think of complexity, all you have to do is ask your questions. It's like any big project that you got to chop it up into small bits. And you aim your attention at those pieces. And you'll find that, oh, this gap is not necessarily that daunting. I could learn something, or I can kind of sit back and understand that these answers might be on their way. Depends on the sort of thing you're looking for. With fear, it is harder to ask questions against a climate of fear. And I think that one of the strongest things we can do is examine where that fear comes from and ask ourselves if we're certain about the source of that fear. Can we be curious about the source of that fear? Are we sure, that the threat exists at that deep of a level? Can we start to approach it? And if we approach it even with one little question, one more question in a conversation across difference, or one more conversation you wouldn't have otherwise had, it doesn't have to be too drastic, but you can begin to do something really beautiful, which is you lessen the fear bit by bit. I don't know if you've all had this experience, but I've had it many times where somebody holds a perspective or has something that sort of makes me wary, and then I approach them and I begin to talk to them, and almost every time it's not what I thought it was. And so what happens is I walk away from that interaction with a little less fear about that gap and a little less fear, and that's really magical because the less fear we have, the more creative we can be. And that's something that if we can boost the creativity in our society right now, man, we've got a lot of problems. So maybe we could solve them.
All right, so I want to talk a little more about the questions you could ask. So if you are in this momentum, you're sort of, your heart rate's beating and blood pressure spiking, and do you have any go-to questions you can ask to help you sort of recover, even if you don't feel like you're in your best state? And there's oftentimes situations where having to think in those moments is really hard because you're flooded, you're triggered about something. What can you share with us that might help us, like, even if it's a little bit on autopilot, sort of say in those moments?
Yeah. I mean, the big thing is, do you need to take a break? I mean, if you're really triggered and things are, you're feeling really emotional about something. I was just talking the other night actually with someone who was telling me how many cross divide conversations he's had that had a kind of breakup in the middle, where they would be going back and forth for a little bit, and then the other person would say something just so aggravating, that then he would think the thought, I can't talk to this person anymore. And so and he would walk away and just think, I'm not even going to call him again. But then a little time would go by and he would think, I can't give up on this. I really can't. Let me go back. And so this is a pattern with this particular person that his friends sort of joke about, but it works, because your emotions go up. Things seem a certain way. Your kind of identity and your own perspectives just lead you to think that this is just unacceptable. And so a break and hitting reset can really be one of the best things you can do. And then the other thing I would say is, if you feel like you can stay in the moment, then how can you still be curious? One of the things that you can say is just to actually be honest about your feelings about it. What you just said, I just gotta tell you, that makes me really uncomfortable. Can I share why? And that's really powerful. Sometimes we want to hide our emotions in those conversations, or we think that anger is a reason to just go for the exits. But anger itself is data. Emotion is data. There's a wonderful quote by an author named Valerie Kaur: anger is a force that protects that which is loved. And so when someone gets angry, it's a clue about what they really care about. When you get angry, it's a clue about what you really care about. So you can also begin to share your concerns. You can say, maybe you're seeing me getting a little animated, a little bit like, caught up. And here's why. It's because this is what's at the heart of this issue for me. And you can decide if it's the right time to do that. But candor is usually your best bet.
Nice. Okay, so here's another one. Speaking of online interactions, I guess, how many people here have either said or participated in a thread that starts or includes the phrase unfollow if you disagree? I guess there are a lot of Black Bravery Angel people here, but
yeah.
So I know that I've personally been in, with relatives, family, even old friends, conversations where we might disagree about something, but the prompt is if you don't agree with what I'm saying, unfollow me, or if you say something against what I'm saying, I'm going to block you, that kind of stuff. It's going to happen on Twitter, on Facebook, Instagram. And I guess the assumption here is there are moments in time when you might not feel you're venting about something, and you may not have the emotional capacity at the time to really entertain or have curiosity. Is it more important to not say something and wait until you are resourced to post something like that? Or is it okay to sometimes admit that you don't have the capacity to feel curiosity right now?
Yeah.
And how would you recommend going about that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's such a personal choice. I was on a podcast not that long ago where, we were having the discussion about how to do all this, and finally I kind of said, I'm not saying that you have to go talk to a Nazi tomorrow. And when I said that, the hosts just sort of burst into tension-relieving laughter, because they sort of thought that's what this is all about, isn't it? They kind of thought about sort of the worst, the hardest possible conversation. That's what this work is about. That's what I need to go do. And I sense this sort of a lot with these kinds of approaches, that people go automatically to what might be the hardest thing, and how impossible that might feel. But really, at the end of the day, is having these kinds of conversations is strongest when it's one-to-one. And each of you and everybody else is going to have those conversations when you think that it's worth it, and that it's valuable, and that it's important. So if there's a particular perspective that is just too far out there, then it's too far out there for you, and that's okay. There's a wonderful story by a man named John Powell. He's the head of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, so not too far from here. And he talks about a pastor who challenged him. John is a famous bridger, and he really champions these ideas. And the pastor said, "John, are you telling me to bridge with the devil?" And John looked at him and said, "Maybe don't start there. Just don't start there. Why would you?" And the idea being, build small bridges, that all of us have like a circle where we're comfortable, and maybe your circle is like this, maybe your circle is like this. The only work here is just to go up to the boundaries and push a little bit wherever you happen to be. And then what he says is, you'll build a lot of small bridges, and then you might wonder who you're calling the devil. And that's that's a tricky thing, but it does take patience, and I think it takes a lot of self-acceptance that nobody does this at the same pace. Nobody needs to. And really, all I think we need is just, if everybody asked one more question before jumping in with their opinion. If everybody chose to ask someone about their concerns rather than just doing a showdown about conflicting perspectives. If everyone did that once tomorrow, right? It's not that everyone is stuck to a Nazi. It's if everyone can ask one more question, push the boundary one click, we would already be a more curious culture.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I want to go to a slightly controversial question, I guess, which is, have you found that in espousing and talking about depolarization and sort of making these bridges, that you've gotten, what are the kinds of negative feedback you've gotten from people in your own tribe? So talking about myself a bit, I felt this very viscerally when I wrote my book and was talking about this in 2017, 2018. And there's this desire to reach out to the people that are closest to you, and those people are often the people that you often agree with 99% of the time. But the feeling of challenging our own assumptions of the things that are ingrained in our positions and tribe and sort of ideology, that can oftentimes spark even larger pushback from, at least in my own experience. I don't know if you've experienced this. I'm curious if you have, and how you think about it.
And that absolutely exists, and I think, again, it's everyone's personal choice, but I'll share a couple anecdotes. So one that I thought was so interesting is a story I just learned the other day. This woman who is liberal and has a firm opinion on the pro-life side of abortion, who had begun a conversation with her daughter's good friend, who was more conservative and very pro-life. And they had built trust over time and were able to talk about abortion, something that had seemed too difficult for some time. And so the young man had something that I call an "I never thought of it that way" moment. When you think or say "I never thought of it that way," it's evidence that someone said that an insight has crossed the chasm from someone else's perspective to your own. It's very powerful, and it can plant a seed, and it can help you see things differently. And his "I never thought of it that way" moment came when she said, I had 2 abortions, and your friend, my daughter, I had her. She came, and she is who she is because I was ready. I was ready for her. And he said, "I never thought of it that way." Did he change his mind on abortion? No. But he looked at it in a different way. And then a little bit later, she was reflecting on the conversation, and she was thinking about the kind of boy that she would want her daughter to date. And she realized that despite her feelings about pro-life on the issue of abortion, she was like, I'd almost prefer a man like him, because he values life so much that if he were to get my daughter pregnant, he would take responsibility. He would at least take responsibility for that. And that was an "I never thought of it that way" moment for her. And so again, neither of them changed their minds about the underlying thing, but they discovered an angle that they hadn't considered. And another one I'll share is from a protest years ago think it was against the Iraq War that a friend told me about. And so this was Bellingham, Washington, and there were the two camps, you know, sort of the anti-war protesters were sort of the main ones, and then there was a counter protest happening on the other side. And so one of the people in the anti-war camp was kind of looking at the other side, and just, he stood up and he walked over and he saw a woman holding a sign, and he started asking her questions and getting curious. And so it lasted a while, and the woman was answering his questions. And after a while, and he didn't judge her or anything, after a while, she stood up and left the protest because she realized she wasn't even sure why she was there. She wasn't sure if that's what she believed. And his questions had given her a chance to listen to herself. And so what happens a lot in our discursive environment is we drop talking points, we drop memes, you know, whatever sort of feels like, yeah, rah for us, we'll hand it off. But how often do we actually examine our own beliefs? And sometimes when someone approaches someone else with curiosity, that's the opportunity that they have to listen to themselves. And that can be really, really powerful for us to check each other that way. So these are the sorts of possibilities that can, you know, that can at least like get us to scrutinize the idea that asking these kinds of questions across certain divides would be harmful. And I can say more to that, but there's a couple.
Yeah. But how about, so I guess I'm thinking people that, do you have disagreements with people that are liberals like you about the, and what are those conversations like? How do you, because like, I guess I'm asking this partially for myself, and maybe partially for like everyone here around, like, we don't want to only be polarized, right? We don't only want to be arguing with people on another side. We want to have fearlessly curious conversations with people that are our neighbors, our family, people we agree with about a lot of things. How, and we're not used to doing that, especially along political lines. And I guess sometimes we can have a conversation that's constructive in some ways, but if it ever leans towards possibly giving the other side a point, it might be interpreted as betrayal in some sense. Like, and how do you experience that at all? And how do you react to that?
Yeah, so that's where the following becomes really important. And in the book, I talk about 5 conditions for conversation. And one of the ones that really is the most important to watch is containment. Many of our conversations are not contained to the people participating in them. They include an invisible audience of listeners that might be really big, and we don't even know. And we don't often stop to think how weird it is that we speak into these social media platforms without having any idea who's listening, what their reaction is, what they think about what we just said. So a lot of the objections that I hear, you know, when about sort of platforming views, right? Platforming dangerous views. What if I ask a question and then they give an answer and maybe there's disinformation in there and then someone else? It's almost as if it's like we're pretending that the only way to have a conversation is on social media in the public. When you contain a conversation to one, that fear of harming others or of some idea and, you know, infecting and carrying throughout the discourse, it's no longer quite relevant. And all that's left is to be afraid that the idea will infect you, that something they said is going to maybe, you know, change your mind and make you someone you don't want to be. And what I say to that is, that's not how our perspectives work. If that were to happen, if you have a conversation with someone and you came in really wary about their views and they say something that changes your mind like that, that's not because of what they said. It's because of the fertile ground in your mind and your heart and your life to hear it. That's the actual variable that matters. Our opinions, we don't choose them. They're a result of our experiences and our values. We have deep roots all the way into the ground. So when I hear people have this fear, right, that one idea, one conversation, something they hear will completely change them, I think what's happened is we've embraced the ethic of the internet where we are our opinions, and that's all we are. We're not people with rich roots, rich history that goes all the way down. The internet is a non-place that makes us into non-people. We forget that there's lives back there. So I talk about in the book that we don't see with our eyes, we see with our whole biographies. So when we tend to just discuss about our opinions, we're not getting curious about the people. We're not asking each other where we all come from. It's very hard to see where people are if you don't understand the path they took to get there. So getting curious about our paths can really reveal a lot. But again, you know, if it's like, why are we so afraid of our own constitutions? Do we really think we're that vulnerable? And I sort of think that maybe we think we're that vulnerable now because we live in a time where it's somewhat acceptable to view others as monsters, and ideas made them monsters, and so ideas can make us monsters too. But I think that there's something poisonous in there about how we're looking at human beings that I think we need to reframe.
And I think I have one more question, then we can open it up to other people. And so one of the things I really loved about the book was just how much of your personal life experience you weave through it. And you talk about a couple of your favorite words.
Yeah.
I don't know, sobremesa.
Sobremesa.
Yeah. So tell us about that word and why and how it relates to this idea of you're talking about, you know, being your whole self. And we understand this in the context of a dinner table, sometimes like around a campfire, that kind of thing. But it's really hard to translate that to a lot of other places. But when we think of like, do you think we should bring back this idea of, you know, how do we be more our whole selves in conversations that are online, or is it something that has to happen in a house, in a room? And yeah, so but first start with like sobremesa. What does that word mean?
Yeah. So sobremesa is the conversation that happens after a meal. Sobre means over and mesa is table. So it's a word in Spanish that has no English translation. So it's absolutely one of my favorite words. And I write about growing up and going to Mexico for 1 or 2 months out of the year, and you know, sitting there with my family. And as a child, the mystery of how in the world my aunts and uncles and my grandparents and everybody, they just ate. And I would go and be allowed to watch TV and have fun. And they would just sit there and talk. How is that enjoyable? The mystery of why adults find conversation enjoyable was just so confounding for so long to me, until I realized that it's in conversation that we see each other, that we connect with each other's experiences, that we form bonds. What's really interesting is that when you meet a new person and you just have a conversation, watch for how tempting it is to interrupt the other person as soon as you find something in common. Oh, I went to that school too. Oh my gosh, you grew up in New Hampshire? So did I. You know, conversation is a superpower. It's a beautiful, incredible capacity that we all have. And I think of our language really gives us a lot of hints about the wisdom of it. You know, we are in conversation. Conversation is like a place. It is unique. You know, if I have a conversation with you, we're never going to have that conversation again, because it's you in this moment. It's me in this moment, having walked my path. You've walked your path, and here we are. And it is a chance for us to share the meaning that we carry within us, to share the concerns that we have, and then let them mix and mingle and enrich each other. Now, your second question, I think, was about, can we do this online? I'll say this. One of my good friends and a great writer, Angel Eduardo, says social media is the boss level of discourse. So it's not that we can't do it, it's that the difficulty level is higher. Again, because you don't see people, because the platforms constrain. And I talk about those 5 conditions of curious conversations. You don't really have people's time. You can't guaranteed have their attention. They could be like texting you from the back room or from walking to work or whatever. You don't know what they're doing. There's all these things that make it harder. It is not impossible, but you do have to go more out of your way to be curious.
Right. So yeah, speaking of conversations, let's open it up. What kind of questions do you have about this topic for Monica? You know, all right, let's. I'll just point to people. How about you in the back?
Early on, I was trying to open myself up the way of talking to another person, and I have a friend who I really liked, and we never discussed politics very much. And I asked her something so she could explain what she was feeling, and the things that she said were so hurtful and so triggering to me. My whole intention was to be receptive to the other point of view. But what happened was I was just in pain
Oh,
from listening to it, you know, because she was very
Yep.
judgmental about,
Mhm.
you know, people of other states, people of other national, you know, colors, people of other lifestyles, you know, so it didn't work out well.
Yeah.
My attempt to open up to the other perspective,
Yeah.
it just hurt, basically. you know. We
Yeah.
just went back to not, I like her very much. We went back to not discussing those issues.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
stayed friends. How do you deal with that?
Should we repeat that a little bit?
Yeah, could you just reframe the question for our viewers online?
Okay, yeah, so I think you were saying like you had wanted to come to a friend with really open perspective and ask about how they're doing, and they sort of just unloaded a lot of insults maybe, or things that were painful or hurtful.
Well, I purposely asked her about her positions, which I knew was opposite mine. I knew she was conservative.
Mhm.
And I was trying to make a bridge
Mhm.
by listening to her, by
Mhm.
opening up and letting her just say what she
Right.
felt. And it ended up just hurting me.
Yeah, like that's first wave of like sort of all the things that you've been keeping to yourself, just like blurting it out. So yeah, how do you deal with this
Yeah.
or respond to it?
I mean, yeah, when the pain comes, I mean, that again, I think you probably did the right thing, you know, put a stop to the conversation, take a break. What's most fascinating in what you said is that you maintain a relationship with this person, right?
Yeah.
So, and that you were attempting to build a bridge in your conversation. So what I would say is the bridge is already there. The bridge is your relationship. And the most important thing about a bridge is to keep it, not cross it. So it may not be tomorrow, it may not be when you want, right? But as long as the possibility is open that this friend might be curious enough to question her own assumptions that cause pain, if she has you to call in that moment, that's really precious. What it takes from you is the courage to keep the bridge. And that does take courage, especially if you're afraid that pain may come again, right?
As long as I don't ask her.
Right.
We kind of agreed mutually that we're just not gonna go there.
Yeah. And maybe that's the sort of détente that many folks reach. But what I found too is that people will tell me, you know, the détente works for a minute, works for a while, but at some point you may find yourself ready to get curious again. And maybe we'll see, right? And maybe you'll know a little more of what's coming. And maybe it's an invitation, not a request. Maybe you can accept, you can try to get curious about how she came to those views. Not what the views are. You don't want more of that hurting you and punching you in the face. But how did you get to that? And turn her into a storyteller about her life. That'll help you connect, you know, to other things, and it'll help her listen to herself. And some interesting things can happen then.
That's that one thing. The image that comes to mind for me is like when you turn the water off at your house for a long time and you turn it back on, and like all the brown water comes up first, and then it
Yes,
starts running
yes.
clear after a while.
Yes.
It's like the fact that you didn't react to her immediately might, you know, keep that bridge open, and it invites the next wave of conversation. So
Right.
hopefully,
Right.
all right. How was next over here?
Just as I was listening to the conversation about the one-on-one, and I'm just thinking, how do we apply this to our leaders? You know, locally, it just seems like there's this culture of name calling and putting people down and not even listening. And I don't know how as a society or as just individuals and citizens that we can turn that, can switch it, can do something even on a personal level to help our leaders do something like this.
So the question was, how do we sort of apply this to our leaders and our people that are, you know, making
Yeah.
decisions that impact our lives?
I'm going to say something really counterintuitive, which is with a lot of empathy. And here's where that comes from. So as a journalist, I can speak to the forces that make our media so polarizing. It's not the desire of each individual person in media to make it this way. It's a system. It's a systemic issue where there's a lot of incentives aimed the wrong way. There's these platforms that constrain our communication and ability to see each other, the economics of the attention economy, how they push us to one thing. The same applies for politicians. So I've interviewed sitting members of Congress, US representatives, and they've told me this job sucks. That's an actual quote, because they feel they can't govern. But when the cameras are on, when they think about the next campaign, they have to play this game. They hate the game. Now, does every one of them hate the game? No, probably the ones that are the best at it and are carrying their parties, whatever, extreme messages, one way or the other, are having a ball. But most of them hate this, down to the local level, the state level. So it's really the same as everything else, which is to remember that even though they are powerful, they are elected officials, they're still human beings, and they don't like being part of this system. So we mentioned that I work at Braver Angels. Braver Angels has a campaign called Braver Politics. So the workshops that we've been doing for years now on the grassroots level that have transformed the way people can see each other across the divide, we're now having those workshops with sitting elected officials at the state level, in Congress. It's awesome. They're even having us train their staffs in how to listen to constituents past the yelling to the actual concerns beneath, and how to sort of handle the passions and the wildness of that. So I gotta tell you, there are a lot, again, it's the one-to-one, right? You will hear one-to-one from so many politicians, a desire to do this, but a sense that they are trapped. And so, yeah, it's not easy, but I think one of the first steps is reward any politician that you see exercising curiosity in even the smallest way. Because one of the reasons they're not doing it is because they get no rewards from our media ecosystem for the reasons I just explained. So approach this with empathy. They don't like it either, but we're going to have to do it together.
All right. Any other questions? Right here.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating. I just returned from a funeral in Moorpark of a Mexican aunt, 91, the last of 12, and fun to reflect on the ways of talking. I looked at the Internet Archive, and somebody showed up from the Abalone Alliance today, nuclear power protesters from the 80s. A huge group that had a consensus process. Basically, everyone who agreed to be a protester in San Luis Obispo at the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant in 1982 trained in local affinity groups in a communication process. And it actually worked. And I hear, Rainbow Grocery, there are many co-ops who have all the people involved have agreed to participate in a training. It's kind of like a huge family. A huge family, everybody's, they're kind of, you have this commonality because you've been together.
Yeah.
And I hear you mention techniques. And I wonder, I have been wondering for a long time, how to inspire other people to learn themselves, to pick up these techniques themselves. And how education in schools may not do this. Training. I used to be a part of a communications training where we would go to Northrop and show them how to talk peer-to-peer or peer-to-peer. And psychologists who have the training of how to look for emotion, recognize it. I mean, the communication skills that would actually benefit us all. And I haven't read your book, be interested, but the question of, it sounds to me like you're saying, hey, here's these small things that we can do. And I'm going, aha, that's a great step. Is there any way to go further? And it looks like, you have your get-togethers. You may have, a bit more
Yeah.
training.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure there's a question in there.
Yeah, but I can comment on some
I'll
of this.
just summarize it very quickly, which is like you're talking about sort of seeing a community that has built culture around sort of mediating each other's conversations, and it works really well. And how can we, like, there's a big gap between like the infrastructure of that kind of community versus like the conversations, like the tips we can bring to an individual conversation. But is there more? Like Braver Angels is an example of an organization that is trying to do bigger things. And are they separate tools? Are they the same tools? How do you think about that, I guess?
Yeah.
Okay.
Got it. Yeah, there is a really busy and growing and wonderful bridge building ecosystem. It is a reaction to how we have been drawing lines in the last few years. Drawing lines for understandable reasons, but often driven by our fear of other people who, again, the research shows we don't understand. So it's very difficult to make judgments about things that you don't understand. We need to understand people. I think that the most powerful thing that we can do is be a model. So Braver Angels talks about this too, but so do many of the other organizations that allow for the sorts of opportunities that people don't have in their own lives to cross divides. It really all comes down to seeing that the small tactics work, understanding that people can surprise us, and that it is a worthwhile project. My book is less of a script than it is sort of a mind shift. Like think of it a different way, a different framework where we get away maybe from it making all of it about opinions, and we go down to the level of people, and we see what we've been missing. We see more gaps, we see more nuance in the issues that confound us, and everything becomes more open and more possible. So again, I think many of us probably recognize we have been drawing lines around that discourse from all sides for several years. I think out of certainty and out of fear. That's well-founded in that there's been a lot of stress and anxiety in our world. But the best thing we can do is to serve as a model. So even if you serve as a model in one conversation, that you have, and then not another one for another month, that's enough. Here's another little tip that can be really transformative. And it's in the book, but you can speak your opinions as the snapshots of what's in your mind right now. So we tend to tell each other that if we don't speak our opinions with total firm confidence, then we're weak. And that's just silly. That's not true. What you can say is, when I think about abortion right now, here's what's coming to mind. Here's the concern I'm feeling right now about that issue. And as soon as you present your perspective from a place of mobility, just watch and see how the other person echoes that language back when they share their opinion. And now you're in a completely different world. One where your opinions really can move and influence each other, not to change your mind or shift you from the deep beliefs you have, but to allow the conversation to be fluid and to learn. So again, people are uncomfortable with that because you're supposed to come in like guns blazing, but that's not been working for us real well. So a different approach is probably warranted.
Awesome. I think that was our last question for the day, but thank you so much to Green Apple Books for having us here, and for all of you for coming. This book is available for purchase. I strongly suggest you buy it. I've read it many times. It's good. So thank you so much for coming. I think we'll probably be hanging out.
Oh yeah, and I'll sign books as well if anyone would like.
Can you hold a copy for me for till the first of the month?
You can ask Jake, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I have no idea how that works.
I'm asking him, can you hold a copy for the first?
Yeah.
I'm just gonna sign
Yeah.
up. So thank you
All right,
so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yay, thanks, everyone.
Thank you all for coming. I'd like to say thank you to our virtual audience for tuning in. And please do, we have copies of both Monica and Buster's book. Make sure to get a copy, and maybe with that money, we can buy another XLR cable. But thank you so much for being out here tonight. And have a great night. Have a safe night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you hold copies of those books till actually the early till the first of the month, can you?
So you can't grab it until April 1st.
Because I don't have any money to buy books until April.
Okay, we can hold it. Just tell me
Yeah,
coworker up
exactly.
at the
See,
front.
actually.
He'll get your name. So.
Not pick it up on the third. Which one? Good, bye.